For the blacks in America, it took a flamboyant figure, Marcus Garvey, to remind them of their African heritage. In the 1920s, his Back to Africa national movement influenced many blacks. A colorful adventurer and aviator, Colonel Hubert Julian, known as the Black Eagle of Harlem, urged his people to join their brothers in Ethiopia. Blacks were developing a political consciousness. Novelist Richard Wright described their bitter legacy. Our outward guise, he said, still carries the old familiar aspect which 300 years of oppression in America have given us, but beneath the garb of the black laborer, the black cook, the black elevator operator, lies an uneasily tied knot of pain and hope. In the summer of '35, many American blacks signed up to go to Ethiopia.
Portugal began the African slave trade in Europe about 50 years before Columbus arrived in the Americas. The Portuguese called their slaves Negroes, the Portuguese word for black. When African slaves were first brought to the Americas, they called themselves Africans, but the slave masters called them Negroes. That was the official name, and that held for 3 centuries, eventually yielding some space for the use of the word colored. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was established in 1909. The United Negro College Fund was established in 1944. Then came the Civil Rights Movement, and those words, Negro and colored, would no longer do. In the mid-1960s, white America was hearing for the first time the proud declaration, "Black is beautiful." And with the right to vote finally secured, it was time for black power. Negro and colored were rewritten to simply black. Negro and colored remained in the names of some of the older organizations, but they otherwise disappeared from the written or spoken word in America. After 20 years of black, Jesse Jackson and some leading scholars decided in the late 1980s that it was time for the final name change to African American. At a news conference, Jesse Jackson called to announce a campaign with the goal of establishing the term African American as the proper descriptive term. He said, just as we're called colored, but we're not that, and then Negro, but we're not that, to be called black is just as baseless. Black tells you about skin color and what side of town you live on. African American evokes discussion of the world. Jesse Jackson went on to say that day, every ethnic group in this country has a reference to some land base, some historical cultural base. Roger Wilkins, 10 years older than Jesse Jackson and the leader of the Civil Rights Movement, one of the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, embraced the change to African American. In 1989, he told Isabel Wilkerson for a New York Times report, whenever I go to Africa, I feel like a person with a legitimate place to stand on this earth. This is the name for all the feelings I've had all these years. And so it is understandable that people like me, people like Joy Reid, who you just heard, who lived through some of those name changes, think of African American as being coined sometime in the 1980s. We now know that that's wrong by about 200 years. Thanks to a report by Jennifer Schuessler in today's New York Times, we now know that the first recorded use of the term African American was 1782. It was found recently by Fred Shapiro, an associate director at the Yale Law School Library, who discovered an advertisement in the Pennsylvania Journal on May 15th, 1782, announcing the sale of printed copies of 2 sermons written by the African American. One on the capture of Lord Cornwallis. Mr. Shapiro enlisted the help of George Thompson, a retired NYU librarian, to find a copy of those sermons. They found one of the sermons, the sermon on the captured Lord Cornwallis, at Houghton Library at Harvard University. Here is the cover page, Sermon on the Capture of the Lord Cornwallis by an African American. Philadelphia, printed in the month of April 1782. Such are the treasures residing at Harvard's Houghton Library, many of them still patiently waiting for a scholar to discover their historical significance. We don't know if this was the first printed use of the phrase African American, but it is now the first one we know about, and we know nothing about the African American. To the New York Times, Mr. Shapiro says, was it a freeman? Was it a slave? We don't know. We don't really know if the African American was actually a man, but he probably was. And when the author refers to himself in the third person, he uses the word he. On the first page of the sermon, the author mentions, quote, not having the benefit of a liberal education. That's all we know about the author. But I think we know that the author must have heard every term that Americans used to describe him, including the most demeaning and the most hateful terms. But in defiance of all that, and in defiance of that Portuguese word, Negro, that was the most polite word anyone ever used to describe the author, he chose how to describe himself. Without the benefit of a liberal education, without the benefit of a civil rights movement, without the benefit of a Black Power movement or a consciousness-raising movement, or the thoughtful cultural coaching of Jesse Jackson and others, without the benefit of all of that, the author chose 233 years ago to call himself proudly an African American.
Jesse Jackson proclaimed one day in the late 80s, we are now going to call ourselves African American. And a lot of people just thought, well, who were they to decide what we're going to call ourselves now? And it felt at first like a step backwards because black really was a big catch-all, but also so powerful.
I don't know how far back, and I don't know what country in Africa I'm from. I'm not an African American, I'm an American.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Jesse Jackson is urging blacks to begin referring to themselves as African Americans. Historian Robert Hayden supports that idea.
A lot of people have been calling themselves African American or African Americans for years. Many of our college university programs, as at Northeastern, is the Department of African American Studies. People of African descent here in Boston in the 17 and 1800s were using the term African to talk about their social groups and their religious groups. We had the African Meeting House, so I think it's probably the most accurate and most useful term for people whose ancestors came from sub-Saharan Africa.
He can decide this. I don't have to follow.
Elma Lewis, a leader in Boston's cultural community, is opposed to adopting a new identification for blacks.
I keep hearing the discussion that people are called Italian Americans and all other kinds of Americans, and therefore it would be appropriate to say African Americans. But then you see, Italy is a country, not a continent. Africa is a continent. So perhaps we should say Nigerian Americans or Jamaican Americans or what have you. Black Americans would encompass all of us.
How many of you have heard about this debate about the identification of black versus African American? Have any of you heard about that? At the David Ellis Elementary School in Roxbury, we asked 4th and 5th grade students and their teachers what term they preferred.
Whatever they call you, African or black, it doesn't matter because you know what you are inside.
There shouldn't be any connotation. after for the race.
If it's Afro-Americans black, would it also be Afro-England black?
I call it brown.
You call it brown?
Well, it doesn't really matter, because you know who you are.
It'll move some of us to think about our African roots and begin to do our family history. And I think that all black young people particularly, and middle-aged and older people, need to continue to look at their family history.
You can see that I'm an African person. We should teach that to our children strenuously. We should always acknowledge it. We should be proud of it. Whether or not we're Americans is a sometime thing. All black people in this country are not Americans. All black people in this country are black. Let's unite.
Reverend Jackson said, to be called African Americans has cultural integrity. It puts us in our proper historical context. Every ethnic group in this country has a reference to some land base, some historical cultural base. African Americans have hit that level of cultural maturity. Jackson stated that other races could connect their heritage to their mother countries with a sense of pride and acceptance. The term rose to prominence because it was considered more appropriate than black or colored.
The term African American actually rose to prominence because it was considered more appropriate than black or colored. In other words, African American exists because it was once seen as a sort of remedy to the perceived inappropriateness of black, a word that has historically been used for people of sub-Saharan African descent, particularly those who were enslaved.